Hello and welcome to Beginner's Guide to Vampire the Masquerade. Now, in my first video, where I covered the World of Darkness more generally, I said that there were 3 games that you should start with if you're a complete beginner and don't really know where to begin. And the 3 games that were Mage the Ascension, Werewolf the Apocalypse, and Vampire the Masquerade. And of those 3, I think that Vampire is perhaps the best one for beginners to start with. I think that Vampire is the easiest to get into, and it's also the one that has the biggest following. There's a reason why Vampire the Masquerade got an anniversary edition and Mage and Werewolf didn't. Okay, there's a reason why Vampire the Masquerade to this day still gets attention and why people still play it. Okay, it's because it's probably the best in terms of setting. It's the least dated setting. I mean, it's still dated, and I'll get into that later, but it's the one that still works the best, I would say. Whereas Werewolf and Mage can be kind of dated in how they feel when you actually play them. But I'm not going to talk about that right now. We're talking about Vampire. And so before we get into the meat of this video, I have to point out that I've probably recorded this 4 or 5 times now. Because every time I try to get into it, I realize that it ends up being a lore video, and I absolutely do not want this to be a lore video. I might do a lore video one day, but I really don't want this to be a lore video because there's something that I tell all new players when they start out when it comes to getting into Vampire. And it's, the lore is great, fuck the lore. I mean by that. Vampire is perhaps the most detailed setting that White Wolf ever made. It has, I think, the most source books of any of the settings. And so there's a ton of information and a ton of lore about things going on in the background and things that happened in the past and people who are moving in the shadows. And if you try to go in cold and try to understand everything right off the bat, you're going to get extremely overwhelmed. And this is also kind of why I said in my first video about the World of Darkness more generally, is that you should pick only one game to start with. And with Vampire, going to make that even narrower. Okay, so the very first thing that I need to say is this is mostly going to be aimed at players, not storytellers. I'm going to give some advice for storytellers, but by and large, this is for players. And you can kind of extrapolate that if you're trying to run your own game. When we start out, you need to figure out what books you're going to get. And there are a lot of books, as I said. Luckily, you don't need to get all of them to have a general idea of what you need. So if all you really need is the player's guide, preferably 2nd edition. 2nd edition is better than the original, but if you can only find the original for whatever reason, you can use that, I guess. You're going to also want to get the core rulebook, obviously. And if you're a storyteller, you just need the Storyteller's Handbook, and possibly the Storyteller's Handbook to the Sabbat, but I wouldn't if you're starting out, and I'll get into why later. So that's like 3 books. That's really all you need. Technically 2, depending on whether or not you're focusing on being a player or a storyteller. You're also going to want to get the clan book of whatever clan you're going to start with, and I'll get into more detail about clans in a little bit. But you're probably only going to want to focus on one. So at best, when you're starting out, you really only need 3 books. Like, that's all you're going to need. You need the player's guide, core rulebook, and whatever clan book for whatever clan you're interested in that you read about in the player's guide. That's really it. That's where you should focus. Don't let yourself get dragged into, like, all of the extra books, because you'll end up in a rabbit hole, and you'll get really overwhelmed. So keep things and focus really on the basics when you're starting out. And then once you kind of have an idea, you can branch out from there. One of the great things about vampire is that because the lore is so well written, by and large, it's not hard to kind of branch out from things that you already know or are interested in. It can be really overwhelming, like I said, if you try to absorb it all at once, but it can be really easy to absorb new information if you just kind of like start with one thing and branch out from that. So, to give you an example, if you start with your clan book and go, okay, they're talking about their interactions with other clans at this point in time, then you can refer back to that when you read that clan's clan book. So, how do I put this? For example, if you're reading the Bruja clan book and it's talking about Carthage and their perspective on everything, you can relate that to the Ventru when they're talking about Rome, and you can kind of see both sides of it and kind of understand it. But now this is the time when I kind of have to get into lore, and I'm going to try to give you like the cliff notes of the cliff notes in terms of the lore of Vampire, because there's a lot of lore, as I said, and I don't want this to be a lore video. I'm trying to keep this simple. So, I'm going to give you like an extremely simple version of a very complex story. It all begins in the Bible. Okay, it doesn't actually begin in the Bible, but it begins with Cain from the Bible, from the story of Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. God curses Cain. In the Bible, I don't think it says exactly what Cain is cursed with, other than he's forced to roam the world and for everybody to hate him. Vampire the Masquerade interprets this as he becomes the first vampire and gets superpowers, essentially. Cain then is like, okay, I'm miserable and lonely. I'm going to sire some children. That's the second generation, and found a city. And then I'm going to go disappear for a while. And then the second generation sires 13 kids. Those 13 kids are like, hey, our parents are awful. And then they kill their parents. And then Cain shows back up to be like, hey, you killed my kids. And curses all of his grandchildren in various slightly ironic ways. And then he disappears again. So those 13 kids are the real important ones, because those are the ones who found the various clans that Vampire kind of focuses everything around. So there are 13 clans, which sounds like a lot, but in reality, you only need to pay attention to like 8 of them, at most. Those 13 of Generation 3 are the Antediluvians. You're going to hear that word thrown around a lot. Antediluvian. It just means before the flood. And it is kind of a catch-all term for super old vampire. In Vampire, there's a couple things which are super important to pay attention to, which come up a lot. Clan, obviously, is a big one. What clan you belong to is extremely important, because it determines what kind of powers you have and what kind of weaknesses you have. Different clans have different abilities that come more naturally to them, and obviously have different connections and different histories with each other, so there's lots of opportunities for storytelling and for conflicts to kind of spring out of nowhere, I guess you could say. The next thing you need to pay attention to is generation. Generation just means how many steps away from Cain are you. Generally speaking, the higher your generation, the weaker you are, or the younger you are. Cain is obviously Generation 1. The progenitors of the clans, the Antediluvians, are all Generation 3. And then most vampires and modern knights are somewhere between Generation 10 and 13. Beyond 13, you end up with really thin blood. And that's a plot point of the greater world that I'm not going to get into. When you're making a character, you're probably going to want to stick to somewhere between Generation 13 and 10. I think the game rules allow you to go up as far as 8. Absolutely do not go further than that. If your storyteller allows you to make characters that are like Generation 5, either your storyteller is insane, or they have an idea that they're not telling you. And if your players come to you trying to justify rolling a Generation 4 or something, absolutely do not let them do that. Because older vampires, lower generation vampires, are extremely powerful, and they get access to abilities that most other vampires are not allowed to have. Age is power in vampire, and generally speaking, the older the vampire, the lower their generation. That's not a hard and fast rule, but by and large, that's the rule. Now, with that, there are 3 major factions in vampire. You're only going to need to really pay attention to one of them. Okay? And that's the camarilla. The camarilla is the main faction across most of the Vampire the Masquerade world. And it's the one that most player characters are probably going to have interactions with. If you're a new player, you should absolutely start with the assumption that you're living under a domain of some prince, that being the leader of that domain, that's a part of the camarilla. The other 2 are the Sabbat and the Anarchs. And you probably don't want to assume that you're going to start with either of those. And yes, I will explain why. The reason I want to start with the camarilla is that the camarilla as a structure makes it very easy for new players to kind of get their feet wet without having to worry about, like, not knowing what to do. The camarilla is, to put it bluntly, an old boys club, and there's a lot of, like, political machinations in the background, and so it's like, it's really easy to link new players' characters to, oh, this elder wants them to do this, or your clan is trying to do X or Y, and they want you to go and do it. It's a real easy way to get plot hooks and to give new characters and new players something to do where they can feel like they're accomplishing things, because part of the problem with the Anarchs and the Sabbat is that it kind of takes the strings away. And that's great if you're playing with players who are really good at coming up with ideas and plot lines on their own. But for new players, it can be kind of overwhelming to have the ability to do anything. And there's other reasons, which I guess I can get into. The camarilla is really focused on, like, power plays between elders, and is focused on kind of, I guess you could say, slow burn plots and things, where everything is very, like, Den of Snakes, is the best way I can put it, where everybody's acting like they're all friends, and yet they're all waiting for the opportunity to knife each other in the back at the first opportunity. Okay, and so they're all playing chess with one another, and so it's simple enough to get, like, stories going, and it's simple enough to slot new characters in and give them that kind of ability. There's also the matter of the Masquerade. So, it's called Vampire the Masquerade. What is the Masquerade? Generally speaking, the Masquerade just means don't do anything that would let normal people be aware that vampires exist. Okay? So, for example, a Masquerade breach can be anything from, oh, somebody saw you feeding on someone else, to someone saw the Bruja pick up a car and throw it at someone. Okay? Like, there's a huge, like, span, I guess you could say. There's a scale of violations, to easily covered up to extremely hard to cover up. And generally speaking, the Masquerade is the thing that everybody has to avoid breaking. So everybody kind of wants to kill each other, but they have to do it in a way that doesn't break the Masquerade. Because if they break the Masquerade, the mortals will just rise up and kill them all. And they don't want them to do that. So generally speaking, a lot of plot points and a lot of stories are about, okay, we need to do this, or we need to cover this up, or we need to manage this without breaking the Masquerade further. It's basically the concept of the Masquerade. And I love this up because in the context of the Camarilla, this is really important. if you're playing a Sabbat game, it's not important at all, because the Sabbat do not follow the Masquerade. In fact, the Sabbat view the Masquerade as being a restriction or a plot by the elders to keep all of the neonates, that being young vampires, down. The Sabbat revel in breaking the Masquerade, and they spend their times doing horrible, monstrous stuff whenever they get the opportunity to do so. Most vampires view Sabbat members as lunatics and psychopaths, and most Sabbat members would probably tell you that that's a nice way of putting it. Essentially, the reason why you probably don't want to start a Sabbat game if you're a new player is that Sabbat games take all of the guidelines that make things easier and throw them in the trash. And in general, this creates two kinds of new players. It creates the kind of player that ends up like clamming up and not knowing what to do because they have so many options, and so what they end up doing is just following someone who seems like they know what they're doing, and that's not really fun for them or for the storyteller, because the storyteller's going to spend most of their time trying to get this player to open up and do things, and the player's not going to want to make mistakes, so they're just kind of going to follow the ones who seem like they know what they're doing, and it's not going to be very fun for anyone. The other kind of player this creates is the one that kind of just throws everything to the wind, and they stop caring about like anything, and they're like, I can just make a new character if this one doesn't work out, and they just kind of go balls out. And that can be kind of fun if you're writing a story where that kind of thing is going on, but if you're trying to run a game that's more than just combat or constantly trying to cover up mistakes by other players, it can be very frustrating to have a player that seemingly isn't taking it seriously because they're trying to find out where the rules, or I guess you could say where the boundaries are for the game you're running. And so that's why I don't recommend running a Sabbat game as your first game, and I don't recommend running in a Sabbat game as your first game, unless you have a storyteller or players who are willing to kind of help you or guide you along. I would not, running from personal experience, take a bunch of new players and run a Sabbat game. Okay, I would not personally do that, because while Sabbat games can be a fun and chaotic romp that's entirely different from running a camarilla game, as I said, it can be kind of overwhelming for new players who don't really know what they should be doing, or alternatively, don't know necessarily where the line is. And I'm going to get into talking about edgelord players in a little bit, so just kind of take that thought and put it aside for a moment. We'll come back to edgelords in a little bit. The faction I mentioned before were the Anarchs, and the Anarchs are just the Camarilla, but they don't call themselves the Camarilla, and they don't follow the Masquerade. They follow their own thing, which basically boils down to don't make trouble for everybody else. And they're not a huge power base, like, anywhere, except for California. Like, there's this Anarch Free State in California, and again, it's basically just the Camarilla, except they don't call themselves the Camarilla. They follow the various tenets of the Masquerade. They just don't call it that. And really, there's no difference, but because there's not a huge amount of difference, it's just more complicated, I guess you could say. Like, unless you're running a game that focuses around anarchs specifically and their, like, political beliefs, it's better just to run a camarilla game when you're starting out. I would say it can be very fun and rewarding to run a anarch game when you know what you're doing, because you can kind of get into like the differences between, okay, there's these group of elders that claim to be for freedom and changing everything, and there's this group of elders that wants to keep everything the same, and you can get into a lot of different storylines with that. But as a new player, you're going to look at these two things and go, these look mostly the same. And because they're mostly the same, it's usually easier just to work with the Camarilla. as your base game, because there's a lot more written about the camarilla, and so you can draw in more like story beats when you're coming up with a character. Yes, I can kind of give you a little bit more detail without going into like a ton of lore. So what's the camarilla? The camarilla is an organization of elder vampires and all their kids that exists essentially to preserve the camarilla. It is an organization that exists to preserve the organization. The short version is, a long time ago, vampires used to just wander around openly. Like, even up to, like, the 1100s, vampires would just be like, yeah, I'm a vampire and I drink blood, and that's just how it is. And then the Inquisition happened, and vampires suddenly lost their shit, and were like, this is pretty bad. And then on top of that, there was a huge revolt by a bunch of younger vampires who were not very happy that their older vampires controlled everything still. And that's the Anarch Revolt. And these two events kind of convinced all of the elders that, we're all of different clans, but we should probably come together before all of our kids kill us. Or mortals kill us, for that matter. And so, the camarilla was invented. And the camarilla, as I said, exists to preserve the camarilla. It is a old boys club that exists to preserve vampires and their power structures and little else. So they spend most of their time sitting around plotting against each other and trying to cover up any knowledge that they exist. And that's the long and short of it. But as I said, that's what makes it so easy to make various characters for camarilla run games. Now that we've covered all of this, let's talk about character creation in a little more depth. So, when we're talking about creating characters, we need to talk about stories. So what are the kinds of stories that you tell in Vampire the Masquerade? Vampire the Masquerade is great because it offers two major kinds of stories that can be run simultaneously. So the first is character-driven stories, where you have, like, stories about individuals who are coming to terms with the fact that they're a monster now. So we have, like, these Dracula-esque stories of people being like, am I human still? Am I a monster? I drink blood. I do horrible things. Can I still be human? You have to spend your nights fighting with your beast. That is your killing urges. There are various other things that eat at your mind that you have to deal with. You have these personal stories of, you never change, so can you still be considered human? And there's a lot that you can write there. The other story is the Camarilla versus Sabbat versus Anarchs, like, global jihad, and that's actually the term they use. The jihad, which is the vampire versus vampire power struggle that goes on across the globe. And if you want to write that's all in on that struggle for whatever reason, you can. And that's really what makes Vampire the Masquerade great for new players. It's this flexibility between personal story and, like, faction versus faction global struggle that allows players to make a wide variety of characters and have them all interact well, I guess you could say. In a way that isn't really true for werewolf or mage. So, when you're starting out, it can be kind of, worrying. You're like, okay, am I writing, what is everyone else writing? Are my fellow players writing characters that are all in on factional struggles? Are they writing personal stories? And the best thing is, you can write either and have them all interact, and it'll work fine. So you don't have to worry about that. That's what makes it great for new players. But obviously, having a lot of options can be kind of overwhelming. And so this is where I kind of have to give some warnings about what not to do when you're coming up with a character. Vampire obviously deals with vampires who are, in some cases, thousands of years old. My recommendation for new players is to never make your vampire over 100 years old. Okay? Which means, at this point, never make a character who is older than, like, World War I. And that seems kind of weird, but the reason I say that you should do that is because it will shorten the amount of information and research you're going to have to do to write this character correctly. That doesn't mean that you can't write an older character. It just means that if you do that, you're going to probably need to do some more research about their backstory and come up with a good idea of why they are the way they are and what they were doing through all those years. Okay, if you want to sit down and be like, I want to write a character who was around in 1600s Italy, you can do that. But you're going to have to write like 400 years of backstory, or at least have an idea of what they were doing through all of that and explain why they are here now or how they got here. Because it's always a temptation to write somebody of a time period that's so far removed from the present that now you have to explain how do they interact with modern stuff. So it's like, if you sat down and were like, I want to write a Viking, it's like, okay, so they're from like 1200 AD, and how are they going to interact with lighting? Like electric lights, or phones, or cars? Like, how do they deal with modern technology? How well do they understand it? Or even asking basic questions like, do they speak a modern language? Because that's a question when you're dealing with really old vampires. Because there's always one guy who's like, I'm going to write somebody from ancient Rome. It's like, okay, well, the Romans spoke Latin. Nobody today, except for the church, speaks Latin. So do you speak a language that anybody can understand today? All right, there's always somebody who's like, I want to make a crusader from the Middle East. And it's like, okay, they speak Old French, not modern French. Do you have any way to explain how they communicate in modern day? Or to go even further, you make a character who is 800 years old or something, okay? And literacy barely exists in that time period. Most people do not read or write. How do you navigate modern society if you can't read or write? Like, most old vampires had kids who could read or write, or had mortal servants who could read or write for them. They didn't need to do it themselves. And so, if you're going to write this kind of character, you have to consider things like that. That's what I mean when I say you probably shouldn't, as like your first character, go back further than 100 years. In fact, sometimes when dealing with new characters, it can be best to be like, you were embraced tonight. Okay, you're brand new to the world of vampires. So that covers, okay, you speak a language, you understand how modern technology works. You don't have to work very hard to justify how you get around on a regular like night. Okay? Because a guy walking around in like full Viking gear, speaking Old Norse at random people trying to feed, is just a walking masquerade violation. And so you don't want to have to like constantly worry about how you cover that up. Okay, so when you're talking about running a game, and you're talking about running a game for new players, you're going to want to make it as easy as possible for your characters to get around and interact with people. You're not going to want to run a character where you constantly have to stop and think, okay, does this character know how to hail a cab? You know, does this character know how to get an Uber so he can get across town? Does he even speak a language that anybody has spoken in 500 years? You know, you don't want to do that. So now that I've covered, start getting into the edgelord problem. So remember earlier when I said you got to worry about edgelord tendencies? This is where we kind of circle back to that. So the world of darkness is obviously very dark. Okay? And there are lots of horrible things that happen as part of the setting because it's a horror setting. It is a horror game. And so that can attract a lot of people who are, how should I put this? Not sensitive to what is allowed and what isn't allowed. Like, I'm not talking about, like, being a snowflake. I'm talking about, like, there has to be some kind of line in terms of what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, and what you're comfortable with doing. Because if you don't, there's going to be players and sometimes storytellers who do not grasp where the line is. Now, this is made easier for them because the Vampire the Masquerade books were written during the early 90s grunge, like, edgelord period of, like, counterculture. Okay, and so they put all kinds of things into these games that today we would probably view as being less than acceptable to voice. I mean, there's an entire clan of vampires called the Ravnos who are basically Roma, and the word that they use is the G word, which I can't say on YouTube because it's a slur. Okay, there's an entire book called that G word about the Roma people, where it makes them out to be magical by virtue of being Roma. That's the kind of weird racist stuff that got put in because it was the early 90s. To say nothing of how they talk about, like, gay people and stuff like that. And going beyond that, as I said, the Sabbat don't care about anything. They are monsters and do they do things like, hey, what if we made a Christmas tree out of dead babies? And that's just the kind of stuff that the Sabbat do on Tuesday. So you can easily end up with edgelords, and this is one of those things where I warn people to kind of look out for those people, because it's a giant red flag in character creation when they try to pass off things that are obviously not okay. Was when I give you some examples of things that I've seen multiple times, which people, for whatever reason, gravitate to try and be edgy. One of the clans is called the Ventru, and the Ventru have a weakness where they can only drink certain kinds of blood. So, for example, when you become a Ventru, it's like, okay, you can only get satisfied if you drink male blood. Or you can only drink the blood of people over 40. Or you can only drink the blood of blonde people. Okay, and I'm sure some people have already imagined what some of these red flags could be. The main one that I've seen that is a giant red flag is the guy who tries to pass off a character who is like, oh, my Ventru can only drink the blood of children. Okay, because what that means is my character has to hunt and feed on children. Okay, giant red flag that somebody has decided that that's their character. That's what they want their character to do. Okay, I'm not saying that a character like that wouldn't exist. I am saying that if somebody sits down and suggests to you that this is their, like, first draft, giant red flag on, like, being an edgelord. Because if you just know that, like, that's going to be a problem. Okay? There is also Malkavian. Now, Clan Malkavian's weakness is when they are embraced, that is to say, when they are turned into a vampire, their mind is broken and they gain some kind of insanity. So every single member of Clan Malkavian is insane in one way or another. This can be everything from they develop OCD, they have borderline personality disorder, they are schizophrenic, or they develop some kind of fetish that they can't deal with. They develop a phobia that overrides everything else, something like that. Okay? And there's always going to be someone who is like, oh, I'm going to write somebody who is extremely misogynistic, or somebody who has uncontrollable sexual urges, or something like that. Like, they'll write a character whose sole purpose is, oh, I have an excuse to commit rape, essentially. Or they'll write, like, oh, they have an obsession with X kind of person. Again, this is another situation where somebody's always going to write the, oh, they have an obsession with children. if any player at any time while making characters mentions children, it's probably a red flag, but it's extremely a red flag when they write it in terms of their character's, like, obsessive weakness. Okay? But with Malkavians, for some reason, it usually ends up as, like, weird fetishes. I think one time I was in a group and one player tried to submit a character that was what we today would call trans, but the way they defined it was, like, they're a cross-dresser, and because of that, they murder anyone who knows their secret, like, Psycho style. Like, and you could run that, but it's probably not a good idea. To me, that's always been a red flag, and again, that's not to say that you could not write these characters. The problem is it requires nuance and tact, and it requires a level of maturity that most players who suggest characters like this aren't capable of. And so if you're a new player, you should probably avoid these things. And if you're a new storyteller and somebody suggests these to you, you should be like, yeah, absolutely not. In fact, if you're a new storyteller and you're new to this, never be afraid to just say no. To just, like, shoot down character concepts, because there's going to be someone who, like, views the whole thing where it's like, oh, it's a horror, genre. It's a dark game. That means I'm going to be dark. And their way of being dark is to be, like, to break all the taboos and make everybody uncomfortable. Okay? Like, they're not being, like, there's nothing deep or interesting about writing the character that can't control their sexual urges towards women. Okay, don't write that character. Okay? Like, don't be that guy, is what I'm putting at. But also, be prepared to encounter that guy. Because there's always someone. That's the thing about dark games. In the same way that there's always someone in Dungeons & Dragons who is like, I'm going to play the chaotic evil character in a party of lawful goods. There's always that guy. World of Darkness games have that guy, which is why you have to be aware of it, which is why I've spent so much time kind of warning you, new players, know what to look for and trust your gut. If somebody comes to the game with a character that is obviously, like, offensive and is trying to be, it's probably not going to get better. I can count on one hand the amount of times that someone has presented a character that my gut told me was awful and that I should not continue interacting with, and I've been wrong. Like, most of the time, my gut was correct. And so I would say trust your gut. Now, having said that, having warned you about all that, I can now get into probably something I mentioned a little bit earlier, but which I will now reiterate in more detail. Now, earlier I talked about how you shouldn't write characters when you're starting out that are over 100 years old, because you don't want to write a character that you don't have a lot of reference for. You want to make your first character, or first few characters while you're getting used to the systems, as easy to roleplay as possible. Okay? The thing that you need to know is, don't write a character or pick character traits that are extremely hard to write. And there's a couple clans in particular where this is more of an issue. Writing a Ventrue is pretty easy, all things considered, because it's like, okay, it's a clan of business people and blue bloods. I can probably think of how to do that. Okay, the Gangrel. Alright, it's a clan of, like, more bestial roaming people who wander around and do things. Okay, I can probably do that. Okay, the problem arises when you start trying to write characters that are outside of your wheelhouse. The big one with this is Clan Malkavian. Because Clan Malkavian is full of people who can have any kind of mental illness that you can imagine, in some cases more than one, I would recommend most people avoid them as your first character. It's not to say you can't write them, but it's So here's the thing. If you're going to write Clan Malkavian as your first character, you're probably not going to want to pick something that you don't understand. Okay? Don't sit down and write a character with schizophrenia if you don't understand how schizophrenia works. Alright? Don't write a character with multiple personality disorder without thinking about how that's going to actually affect your character, or how you're going to roleplay that. You know? Don't write characters, or don't pick character traits that you yourself can't really roleplay, or which are extremely challenging to roleplay. Because when you're starting out, there's going to be a lot of things that is going to be thrown at you. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of systems, and it's easier to learn these systems if you're not constantly having to go, okay, but how do I roleplay this character correctly? The other thing that I need to mention is that it's okay to scrap a character that's not working and start again. Okay? There are some storytellers out there who will get offended if you, like, 3 sessions in, go, you know, I'm not feeling this character. Because they're like, I had all these plans. Yet those are bad storytellers. Good storytellers will always prioritize their players' comfort, and if you, the player, aren't feeling a character, scrap them and start again. Don't stick with a character that you don't like to write or don't like to roleplay, because you're just not going to have fun doing it. But also, there are lots of times that things look good on paper that just don't work when you sit down and write them. Okay? Even I've written numbers of characters where I had an idea and I was like, this character's going to be a lot of fun, and when I sat down with other players and tried to write them, I'm like, this is miserable. And you shouldn't stick with them. Okay? So, what I'm trying to get at is, the character creation process should be directed towards things that you can actually roleplay and things you're going to enjoy roleplaying, but don't put so much effort into it that you feel obligated to continue with it, is the best way to put it, okay? If you're like, alright, I want to write a vampire who was a gang member, who was embraced by his sire, who ran the gang from behind the scenes, and you sit down and you start trying to roleplay it, but you're like, I don't know anything about modern gang culture, and I don't know how to write a gang member, and you're just not enjoying it, scrap it and start again. Okay? Going beyond that, in terms of character creation, I said way back when that though there are 13 clans, there is only like 6 of them that really matter or are important for a new player. I stand by that. Okay, stick with the camarilla clans, by and large. Don't be the guy who's like, I'm going to roll up an Assamite. And Assamites are a Middle Eastern clan of unaffiliated assassins, essentially. Yeah, they're basically just assassin vampires. And I wouldn't recommend rolling one up as, like, your first character just because they're unaffiliated with the Camarilla or anyone else. And so they can be kind of hard to integrate into other stories, because they have their own agendas and own way of doing things. Like, when you're writing a character, you're probably going to want to stick to, like, the 6 major clans within the Camarilla and their way of doing things. White Wolf has helpfully made it rather easy to write them, because there's the most amount of background material on those clans. Like, there's an absurd amount of material about the various Camarilla clans and what they're up to on any given night. Now, in the beginning of this episode, I said that the lore is great, fuck the lore. I'm going to go back to that now, because there's so much lore about what everyone's doing. Like, so many cities have hundreds of years of lore and explanation about what's going on in them at any given time. Okay, there are entire books about specific cities, like DC, Chicago, Paris, London. You know, there's a lot of them. Don't get so wrapped up in the lore that you find it impossible to write your character. Okay? Don't tie your character to super important figures. okay? Don't get so wrapped up in the lore that you create a character that you can't actually write. And for the storytellers, don't tie in major characters. Like, don't start off and be like, okay, I'm going to bring back the antediluvian. Like, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't have Cain as, one of your main NPCs. Just don't do that. Okay? In general, it's a bad idea. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I can really say for beginners that they really need to know, because I think I've covered most of it. I think I've covered most of the points that a lot of people trip up on when they're trying to start out with Vampire. It's like, start off with the main books, start off with the core rulebook, start off with the player's guide, and whatever clan book interests you the most. Or at least write something that doesn't require research to write. Avoid edgelord topics, or avoid edgelord players, because they're going to make your game really uncomfortable. Don't tie yourself to the lore so tightly that you don't have any ability to kind of move around, but also don't remove yourself from the lore so much that you end up kind of with a blank slate. Although if you have a good enough storyteller, you can just do whatever at that point. You don't really need to tie yourself down to the lore. In general, start with the camarilla. Start with the main 6 clans, which are outlined in the player's handbook. Don't generate a character that is too old or too powerful. In general, if you really don't know what to do, like if you really don't know how to write a backstory, generate a character who was sired within like the last 5 years or something like that is still basically in touch with their mortal lives. And I think that's it. I think those are the basic beats that you need to know before jumping into Vampire the Masquerade. I think the rest of it, everything else is basically answered in the core rulebooks. So while I could do videos specifically about clans or specifically about like the Camarilla or the Sabbat or things like that, I think that's all you really need to know about Vampire the Masquerade to get going. Like, if you follow these tidbits that I've given you, you should be able to start better than I did. Let's put it that way. Most of this I've learned through my own personal mistakes or looking at other people's mistakes. So hopefully all of this advice is helpful to you, and you found it useful to listen to. So yeah, see you all next time.